Well, welcome everyone to today's session. My name is Chris Foltz, and I am the Director of Strategic Initiatives for the Human Intelligence Movement. That sounds super exciting because it is, right? I get to spend exciting times with amazing leaders, like one of which we have today. So let's just start by briefly going over a couple things about the human intelligence movement. Obviously, you all know what this is, otherwise you probably wouldn't be here today. But the human intelligence movement is a very interesting organization, and I'm going to call it an organization when it truly is a movement. As an organization, we focus on human intelligence. Now, that's often, especially in modern day times, a hard thing to define. But we look at three main buckets at the human intelligence movement. That's social emotional competencies, adaptability competencies, and cognitive competencies. And all the great things that define us as human beings live within those three pillars as we look at them. Today, we have an amazing guest, but I ask all of you during the presentation, if you have some aha moments or some things that come from what Danelle is saying, please share them inside the chat. We'll make sure that there's some time at the end of the conversation today for any of you that have any questions or comments or insights. And as an organization, here are just some of the basic norms that we have when it comes down to actually participating. Make sure you contribute to conversations. We love to see happy faces. Even if you're frowning for whatever reason, I want to see your face as well. I'm going to ask about the frown sooner or later. And of course, any type of uniqueness that you bring here, we celebrate uniqueness. Trust me, nobody's weird in this organization. If so, I'm the weirdest. All right. So today, our guest is probably one of the sweetest people I've met in education, Danelle. And, ultimately, I spent some time ahead of time asking a series of questions, right? I'm like, what matters in what you're doing? And she said something that I don't often hear. She said the importance of leading from the middle. Right. When it comes down to all the changes that we have now, Danelle's had a story because she said it's 30 years teaching. I don't believe she's that old. Right. But at the end of the day, what that means is she has real classroom experience to understand what's required to motivate, lead, and change the lives of our future generations. But it does not just stop there. It's one thing to make an impact on the students, but in order to even get to the place where we can make impact on students, we need to make impact on the teachers. And that's something that Danelle does through her programs and trainings and teaching. She even identified it as somewhat like an incubator, where we're actually taking good ideas, empowering teachers to actually make change from the middle in their districts, understand their place in time, and further educate these students to have real opportunities. So I want to welcome Danelle Almaraz to the program today, and we're going to talk a lot about designing our future and what that actually means. So I'm going to stop sharing screen right now and let Danelle take over this beautiful process while I let some more people in the room. But again, put your aha moments in the chat, and we'll get to you with any questions you have. Danelle, so happy to have you here. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and then let's get right in to your Evolving Mind session.
Oh, good morning. Thank you for such a wonderful introduction, Chris. I really appreciate it. So yes, in education for 30 years, 20 years as a middle school math teacher selling a commodity that seventh graders didn't want. Math was not their top priority in middle school. Moved on to be a categorical director, principal, assistant principal, and then moved on to really try and change education, really trying to see how we could move these hierarchies to more huddles and take the leaders of the schools that really are interested in creating change and empower them by letting them kind of pick what problems do they want to work on. So rather than everything coming top down, really empower them. And so welcome. I see lots of friendly faces in the audience. And so I just want to start with, tell us where you're joining us from and what's your role. So we kind of know who's here, what role do you hold. So if you could drop in the chat what role you have, and then where are you joining from?
So you've got a lot of interesting locations and roles here, Danelle. I love seeing
Right,
the diversity in the audience.
right. San Diego, Chicago, Toronto. Hi, Andrew. Hi,
See, Germany.
Marissa, Stacy. Thank you all for joining. And so really what we want to talk about today is how do we get back to curiosity over compliance? If you think about little children, how many times do they ask why? They ask lots and lots of questions. And then something happens as they get older, they stop being so curious. And I don't think that the curiosity stops. I think that they're stifled. They become compliant. They, come to school, they sit in their desk, they do what they're told. And we really want to move away from being so compliant. And as someone that was the categorical director, that my whole job was compliance, I understand why we think that it's needed, but we really have to get back to the joy of education. Teachers are leaving in flocks. They are not happy anymore. And what I think part of the problem is it's become too tight. We really have taken control over what curriculum they use, when they give assessments. Are they on pace with everyone else? Instead of letting teachers really be the architects of learning, which is why they got into education. I loved teaching math, but I'm not sure I would love in the system we currently have to be told you have to teach this on this day, you have to use this book with fidelity. And so really, how do we get back to that human connection, which teachers are amazing at really getting to know their students? But I think how do we make that adjustment so that we can really get back to teachers enjoying what they do? Mhm. And so that's kind of the idea of in education, often we talk about heroes, like these hero leaders. Oh, we're going to hire this principal that's going to come turn the school around. We're going to hire a superintendent that's going to turn this district around. And I want you to think for a moment, if you're in the field of education, how many principals or superintendents have you had in the last 5 years? So in the chat, let me know. In the past, principals would be principals for about 10 years. So you really got some stability in the school, and they were growing leaders, which I think is right now the most important competency that we need to see in education is not how great are you at doing everything, but how good are you at really growing more leaders. And so part of the work that I've been doing for the last 10 years is really, out of learning. I used to work with just the principals, and now I work with leadership teams so that they're almost like an incubator where we pull together the leadership team and the principal, the coaches, and they choose what they want to work on. Let me say that again. They choose. They pick what problem they want to work on, whether it's tardies, whether it's communicating collaborative conversations, whether it's intervention. They get to pick. That alone empowers them. They're funny though. One of them said to me, one of the teachers says, well, Danelle, if we pick, that makes us accountable. We kind of like when the district just tells us what to do, because then when it doesn't go well, we can just say, well, the district told us to do it. But in this current time, every system's perfectly designed to get the results it's currently getting. And if we continue to do what we're doing, we're going to keep getting the same result, which is teachers leaving, high turnover in principals and superintendents. So why not try something different? Why not empower those school sites to choose what they want to work on and create problem solvers? Which if you look at like the World Economic Forum and what they're talking about competencies, we want creative thinkers, we want leaders, we want kids that communicate. But then on the other side, we have such compliance of everyone following along at the same pace, following this pacing guide. And so those two things can't coexist. And I think between COVID and AI, we really have seen what has happened as far as disrupting the system. But now is the moment in time to say, what are we going to do differently? Any thoughts here, Chris?
Well, I think you bring up an very interesting point. I was in a meeting earlier today with our research committee, and what was brought up was the idea that every single thing that's presented to teachers is they think of it as kind of like an add-on
Mhm.
versus doing something with intentionality that may make it more efficient, may make it more effective. So when we're dealing with this common burden where everything gets stacked onto our educators, how do we handle that concern from teachers,
Mm, definitely. And that's part of when the teachers sit down and they come up with what they want to work on. What I tell them is you are now empowered to say no to anything that doesn't align to that,
Fascinating.
right?
So and how do teachers perceive that, right? Like I'm sure they don't commonly get to say no to something that comes down,
No,
right?
and
So
that's
that's got to be
part.
new.
Yeah, so it's part of the reason I have to work with the district office staff because I prepare them for this day. And I had a superintendent went to a conference, a PBL conference, went to the school and was telling the principal, "Oh my gosh, I went to this great conference. PBL is the next future thing. I really would like your school to take it on." And we have what we call adult sentence starters. That sounds great, Superintendent so and so, but it doesn't align with our inquiry cycle at the moment.
Wow. Now, when it comes down to it, I know that you work a lot with these teachers. Do you spend time at all helping administrators understand the importance of your approach? Because I can imagine teachers are like, all right, Danelle, you're our champion. But if the district administrators or a dean of their university doesn't necessarily see the same way, how do we address that?
So a lot of coaching. So because they've grown in a system that was top down. So all of a sudden they feel like they're not doing their job. Their role now has shifted from being the hero leader to the supporter of whatever their teachers are doing. And they're at the table. The principal is there with their leadership team, with their coaches, and they're deciding together what to work on and what does success look like? What does student success look like if we take on this particular challenge? But I think to your point, education's always an add-on, add one more. But when you give them this clear focus and they really have clarity on what they want to work on for the next 30 days, then they just say no to whatever it is that doesn't align with that. And so that really empowers them to be laser-like focused. When the superintendent came to me and said, Danelle, you prepared me for this day, that they were going to tell me no, that they weren't going to jump onto this new bandwagon that I wanted them to take this adventure. And they said, but I realize now they're focused, which is what we need. They aren't
I see
scattered doing 900 initiatives. They are focused on what they want to accomplish.
Oh, I see someone in the chat says we are the plate as educators. It's not that we're, that's a very good insight. But I also see two people drew attention to your start sentence starters for adults, right? Adult sentence starters. What do you mean by that? Where does that live in this environment? What's an example of something of that
Mm.
nature?
So they're scared, right? They're terrified to know that they now are taking all the accountability. So we role play. Superintendent comes and he's excited about some adventure, some product he just purchased. How are you going to, without losing your job, explain your focus, what you're working on, and not saying that in the future that might be something that you might look at, but for right now, it's got to sit on the side. Or we role play because the leadership team then is responsible for going back to their teachers and say, this is what we've decided to work on. And they'll say, oh, I have prickly Priscilla in my grade level. She's not going to want to do this. And I say, okay, let's pretend. And we actually role play. I'm going to say, oh my gosh, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing one more thing. And then we practice and they'll say, well, the whole leadership team came together and based on the information we were looking at, we really see this as a need. If you don't think this is the thing we should be working on, what do you think we should be working on?
I think you said something, of course, everything you said has been very enlightening, but the idea of role playing,
Mhm.
pretend, if you will. My business partner, Russell, he's an MIT computer scientist, right? So whenever I come back and say, hey, listen, here's what I learned from educators today. And, my question is always like, how do we assess this? How do we observe this? How do we know people are getting to the next level? And without any uncertainty, he always says the best way to do this is through role playing. You can
Mhm.
actually tell through a role play how effective people comprehend the skill, but more importantly, how much they can utilize the skill. And that's probably the best way. So is that something I'm imagining role playing plays a key role to your training and your approach, right?
Oh, 100%. I'll give you another example. Principals go into teachers' classrooms and they want to give them feedback. And so I tell them, write on a post-it note your sentence starter. How do you start a conversation with a teacher that you just went in and observed their lesson? And they'll write it down. Oftentimes I'm with the whole district office staff. And so I'll hand that post-it note to the superintendent and I'll say, walk over and read this to the principal. So how do you think that went? And the principal goes, oh my God, I have a rash. Like I said, so now let's think about you're saying this to the teachers. Now, if it was coming to you from the superintendent, how does that sentence starter feel? Yeah, it feels like it didn't go well. Like, is he thinking it didn't go well? And I said, so we really, our words matter. Words count. We have to be really strategic about the words we choose to use with our colleagues, with our teachers, with our principals, because we use the words that were used with us, but they aren't often the best way to get the best out of humans, right? People want to be seen. They want to be heard. They want to know that you acknowledge that they're working hard. Teachers are probably the hardest working profession I've ever seen, but oftentimes it's overlooked and all we do is nitpick. And so, really helping leaders come up with those basic sentence starters of how do you inspire? When you start as a principal, this is always one of my pet peeves. You're taught how to write people up, you're taught the Frisk model. Who teaches you how to inspire others? Who teaches you how to inspire those teachers that want to be the leaders at the school, right? And it's just a gap. And most principals are hired because they were great teachers. That doesn't necessarily mean that they know how to lead people.
Now, Danelle, you talk a lot about what we consider maybe K through 8, K through 12 education. Does the same approach work when you're dealing with higher education teachers?
I would say so. I would say all, just as humans, right? We
Hmm.
want to be collaborative. We want to be part of the group. We really want to make a difference. You get into education not for the money, but because you want to make a difference in lives of children. And so we've kind of moved away from that, and we need to just kind of recenter ourselves to be more human-centered around, helping people be their best. Everyone, I am a true believer that every human has a gift. And what we often do is we say, oh, Chris is disorganized or he doesn't get to the meetings on time, but he's a beautiful soul, right? Or he knows how to talk to people, he knows how to help people feel seen. And so helping people see what the gifts are that others have that they can bring to the table so that you're bringing everyone's best. That's where collective expertise comes in, right? Bringing everyone's best together with the belief that they can make change, that they can really change the world.
Well, I know you're about to continue on here, but one thing I'd be remiss if I didn't draw attention to Andrew Moss's comment in here. And, I hear about first principles often in my Silicon Valley world that I spend my time in, but people often don't think about how first principles matter pretty much everywhere in life. And what Andrew said here is what kind of human are we trying to create? And you start there and build around that. I think that's very prolific. Thanks for sharing that, Andrew. All right, Danelle, go ahead with your exciting presentation. This is riveting. Thank you.
Oh, and so building that culture of inquiry, we're at a moment in time where there isn't anyone that's an expert. We're all figuring it out. This new world with AI, along with the challenges we have, we really have to look at inquiry as a way to start solving some of those problems. People need some hope, and sometimes just solving one little problem. I'll give you an example. High school. I went in, what do you want to work on? And they said tardies. And I said, okay, what, tell me more. And they said, kids are late like an hour in the morning and they're late to every period. So we studied it. We went and watched, for the day. We looked to see what was happening. It turns out kids were about 2 minutes late to school, but because there was only one attendance clerk that was checking kids in, that 2 minutes turned into an hour. And so the staff said, what can we do? They ended up purchasing something called Minga, where kids could come in, scan their phone. They got a good morning because it's not about scolding. Good morning, so glad you're here. Is everything okay? Running a little late. Is everything all right? And then they rushed them off to class. They would come outside the door in between classes to kind of herd kids in, and they monitored the data by period. And instantly, kids started coming to school. Anything that you measure and watch will grow. And so for
Wow.
3 months, they measured, watched, and they felt like, oh my gosh, we took on a problem that was huge that we've had forever at the school, and we accomplished something just by making some simple adjustments. Then they turned their next thing was to redesign what high school looked like. They wanted to go to block scheduling. So rather than 50 minutes, they wanted to have more time with kids. And so that was the next task they took on. But really treating them as problem solvers and really doing inquiry cycles over compliance checklists, right? Check the box. We did these things. Empowering them to do these inquiry cycles really grows them as leaders.
It's amazing. I think so many people get hung up on, okay, now we have a tool, right? But then they forget about the fundamentals of why they got that tool in the first place and the reliance upon it. And I think you said something hyper prolific. You say a lot of prolific things, but you said anything that you measure and watch will grow. And, trust me, I want to argue with that from a scientific standpoint, but from a human standpoint, I couldn't imagine something more accurate. So
Yeah.
amazing.
It's almost similar to if you go out into the world looking for bad people or bad things, you'll find it everywhere. But the same holds true if you go out looking for good things and looking for little glimmers of hope and little instances of things to celebrate, you'll see more of that. It's just a brain fact. Just like if you say, I'm going to buy myself a yellow Volkswagen Bug. I think I really want one of those. What do you see everywhere you go? You're like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize there were so many yellow VW bugs. But it's just your brain, right? You really have to decide what is it you want to see out in the world and what do you want to contribute. And I think the other piece is that co-learning. It is no longer the principal is all knowing and giving the information. We really need to get to an environment of co-leading and co-learning instead of content delivery, even in the classrooms co-learning with the kids. What do they want to work on? What I do find is that transition to even like a project-based learning approach is difficult for adults because that's not how they learned most for the majority. But when they begin to experience inquiry and co-learning together as a staff, they're more capable of providing that for the kids because now they see the power in it.
Interesting. So, in essence, you are given the opportunity for the students to actually be part of the curriculum design when you ask these questions, right? We forget that just because they're smaller humans, they're humans nonetheless, and they've got a lot to contribute. Now, Andrew brought up a good question here in the chat. You know, Obviously, when you're measuring things, there are benchmarks here. Is it one of those things that the benchmarks already exist, or are we developing the benchmarks through measuring, assessing, and see where it goes? How do we determine what the benchmarks are?
The teachers, they decide. So I'll take the tardy example. What do student success indicators look like? Oh, it looks like, kids coming on time, being excited to come to school. So they have to really dig deep and describe in detail what does success look like because success now is different. And depending on what they're working on, what their inquiry cycle is about, you have to design that because you have to know what are you shooting for? What are we trying to accomplish? And so once they decide on their inquiry cycle, then they as a staff determine what does student success look like. And then in 30 days when we come back, we'll talk about how did that go? And then they'll say, oh, Danelle, we have to add this, or we didn't think about the fact that A, B, or C. And so that student success indicator grows and share it with the kids. I do find that there's often a conflict where when I first get to a school and I want to help, they'll say, like I had a high school and they said, we want to put together a 30-page handbook of all the rules and what we want kids to follow, blah, blah, blah. And then I say, okay, let's look at, World Economic Forum. What do they say that the future needs? And they're like, oh, we need leaders. We need collaborators. We need kids that can be articulate. And I said, do you see how this 30-page rules a handbook in comparison to what you think you want and what really is needed for the future? And they start to see, even in their instructional model, most instructional design is gradual release. I do, we do, you do, right? I'm telling you how you're going to do it. Then the kids do it together. Then they do it independently, but they're not collaborating enough. We want them to be solving problems. Kids are the most amazing humans on the planet. They have ideas because they're not stifled by, oh, I can't. right?
Yeah.
They have the most amazing ideas. And so, you've worked with schools across Africa. I have a colleague that, the African traveling teacher, he goes to communities that don't even have school buildings, but they come together as a community and they decide what problem they want to solve and what does success look like if we solve this problem. And then you just develop it from there. But it's quite empowering for them to, instead of someone's going to save us, that hero mentality, we're going to save ourselves. We're going to come up with a solution to this challenge that we're facing.
You brought up a very interesting point. I was once working with the University in Malawi, Africa, and I was working with their computer science department, but the school had no computers
Mm.
at the time. And I've never learned more about education than what I saw what happened in that room. Because here in America, for instance, if it was a computer science class and there was no computer, I can imagine that it wouldn't be as productive as one. But there they found solutions to teach the coursework. The students were engaged in everything. Now I've got to ask Danelle, I could imagine that when you're dealing with schools or teachers in South Central Los Angeles versus Ponchatoula, Louisiana versus Eden Prairie, Minnesota, there's got to be some differences there. I would imagine that it all starts with how do you define success? What's success to you? But what do you notice about your approach when you're dealing with varying districts and varying levels of teacher?
Good question. What I would say is a lot of times the places I work are high poverty, high English learner. And then I'll be in Park City, Utah, where it's very affluent, right? And so what I do find though is they all are still stuck very much in compliance. And for both parties, no matter if they're in Los Angeles or Park City, Utah, empowering them to solve their own problems is the first step.
That's amazing. Bring up compliance often, that they're all stuck in compliance. This is the first time I've heard compliance brought up so many times. Is almost like a negative word here, right? And I mean, that's really what it kind of is. We know compliance is important. We know that making sure that people have equal access things is important. What is the biggest challenge for people that are stuck in a compliance mindset?
Oh, I would say that often misunderstanding. I was the compliance person, but there is a lot of wiggle room. So I'll take like federal funding, for example. You get federal funding, which means you have to follow some rules. You have to do some things because you've accepted this funding. But when you read closely, they'll give you, say, you have to take this assessment to show whether you've had success at spending this Title I money.
Mhm.
Or you can come up with your own way to measure. No one ever reads the fine print. There are other ways to show that you've spent this money and made some difference. But oftentimes we think that that's the only way because when we were teachers or when we were students or when we were in the district, this is what we understood, or someone gave us this interpretation. I would read through there. I was often the ones pushing the boundaries. Like, depending on how you word the invoice, you can use Title I money for a lot of things. Imagine, I'll give you an example. One school took Title III money and they started a podcast for the English learners.
Wow.
So the English learners were in charge of this whole podcast for the school, elementary school. It was the most amazing thing I ever saw. It was something different than the typical, we purchased an aid that sits in the classroom next to the students to help them, access that language, using Title I to take kids on experiences. One state, they took them whitewater rafting. The science teacher, the English teacher, and the history teacher all took a giant group of kids using Title I funds on this experience. And they wrote about it, right? There are other ways to show that the funding had impact or that you can still follow compliance, but give it a little wiggle room. Try something different. Read closely what it says. If you need help, I'll help you find the little lines in there that say, you can use it in other ways. And so I think that's a big problem with compliance is we think that there's only one way to show that the money had impact. And so that often bogs down the system to try other ways. Like, let's try something else. It requires the superintendent to be open-minded. It requires the board to be open-minded, your principal, which is, I think, the space that we're in now. They're seeing that the things we're doing aren't working. So some are to the point saying, let's try something. I had one school, they did a hackathon. So they did a Saturday, they did a hackathon for the kids to come and build something, but really thinking of what could we do differently? Let's try something different.
That's mind bending. I think you're probably opening a lot of minds up to thinking about how they can use this funding, still meet, but yet exceed the standards of experiential learning. I just met with a STEM teacher from New York, upstate New York, yesterday. And, he was saying that he called it transdisciplinary knowledge.
Mhm.
And what he did is he sat down with the, for lack of better terms, home economics teacher, and he brought a STEM lesson into the home ec class. Now, a lot of people are like, well, what is STEM doing inside of cooking class? But you see, what he did is he taught the students of vector graphics so they could make their own cookie cutters for the holiday season. Once you learn vector graphics, you're able to laser cut or 3D print a cookie cutter from this. That's the last thing that the students thought that they would be learning in home ec, but the level of empowerment, the level of experience that they learn from this is second to none. Many libraries around the country now have 3D printers. They can take that knowledge they got from home economics class or cooking class in this matter and actually go into the library and do something with it if they don't have a printer themselves. I think that's amazing. And I think one of the other things you drew attention to, it's just like in the classroom when teachers teach to the test. This is a common thing that I hear universally. Teachers do not like the idea that we're teaching for some sort of standardized test. And what you're basically saying is when it comes down to the education, it's you need to look at it from the opposite, even when it comes down to experiential. What are the things that we want the students to experience? What are the things that we want them to learn? Because with that, they become almost autodidactic. They're discovering their passions, their goals, and they're unraveling their true human experience. Really appreciate that. All right, I see you're ready to continue on here.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And so really moving from that doing more to doing it different. Like, don't add one more thing. Really sit back and say what it is that we want to work on. Even in the field of AI, when the teachers decide what they want to work on, I had one school, they wanted to work on project-based learning. And so they had all this training from PBL Works, and they really were enjoying digging into PBL. It was doing something different. There were a lot of tears. They felt a little, uncomfortable. And one of the things they said, what would be really helpful, Danelle, is if we could put together a bot that we could ask questions to help us with PBL when we get stuck. We're having trouble differentiating for the lower grades. We're having trouble figuring out how to incorporate more math. And so right there at the table, we took all their rubrics and all the things they'd collected from the trainings and we uploaded and they created their own bot that they now can actually give to new teachers to say, hey, you have questions, right? You have questions. You can ask this bot as many questions as you want to help you get onboarded at our PBL because you know what happens. You get all the training one year and all the teachers are doing it, but you have 5 new teachers and you don't do the due diligence like you did when you started. You just expect them to jump on the treadmill and start catching up, right? They need something to help that. And what they also did is they added a mentor. So every new teacher had a mentor and they got the PBL bot. And so they were creating their own AI, which just like what we talked about before, once you're clear on what you want to do, what you want clear on your inquiry, then you can ask, how can AI support this? How can AI help us? Instead of a one-off tool, what is it going to do to support the thing we're currently working on? And that's
Is
that.
mentorship something that's common in these situations where a teacher may be mentoring someone that's new or new to a system? Is that common or is that a rarity?
Yeah, it just depends. So it depends on the school. Some, it's kind of the responsibility of the grade level chairperson. Some say, no, I don't want to take on that responsibility, right? I don't want to be the person mentoring. And so they really have to make a conscious decision. And it was a gap. They said, well, how are we gonna, this was a big growth for us to move to project-based learning. And the leadership team said, how are we gonna onboard our 5 new teachers to feel comfortable at jumping into something that they maybe have never done before. And so they came up with the idea of having mentors, creating the bot, and then they came back 30 days later and like, this is going great. Then the new teachers said, can we come visit your classroom? And so they got subs. They had the new teachers go in and watch the teachers to see how does it look. What they were funny about was when would go to visit, they would say it feels noisy, it feels chaotic. And I'll tell you this little girl, I went into the classroom and she's building a tiny house, lots of math skills, scaling. And she comes up and she says, "Oh, can I tell you about my tiny house?" And I said, "Sure, I would love to hear about your tiny house." So she goes into explaining. She decided she was leaving out a kitchen because her mom didn't like to cook and they were going to just eat out. And then she said to me, "I'm not sure what the other learning is called, but I have wicked ADHD and I'm never going back to the old way."
Wow.
She realized project-based learning was how she was thriving. She had trouble sitting still. She had trouble paying attention. But now she was beaming, like to grab an adult and be like, "Let me tell you what I'm doing." That's a win, right? And so the teachers realized that they really wanted quiet and control, but that's not what the kids needed. And kudos to them for realizing, you know what? It can be noisy. Learning is messy. It's noisy. It's a little chaotic, but they're having great success.
I'm so glad that that opportunity even arose. I remember, I went to parochial school from K through 12, a Boylan Catholic high school in Rockford, Illinois. And, you kind of live this siloed environment, right? I never experienced public education, never experienced a different classroom than the ones in the students I grew up with. But then our school did an exchange program with one of the local public schools. And it happened to be the public school that I would have gone to that had both the performing arts, we'll call it the advanced performing arts curriculum, as well as the gifted program for the entire school district. So I spent a third of the day in gifted, a third in the performing arts, and a third in traditional classroom. And it wasn't until I had that experience in my life that I realized how valuable experiencing other situations, other classrooms, other methods of learning, not just from the teachers, but from my peers. It was eye-opening, game-changing. Shout out to Carmen Moy, who at the time took me under her wing so I didn't get beat up in the hallway. But the simple fact of the matter is, I almost wish that every teacher had this experience. And I noticed Eric drew attention that each one of the new faculty members has a mentor, and it works very well. Andrew drew attention to the buddy system. It's simple, but it seems brilliant. So it's these simple, actionable things that I think are some of the most important things. And I believe that pretty much any teacher can bring these lightweight, hyper effective methods to their superintendents. It's worth a try. Right.
Mhm.
So mentorship and things like this, I think these are ideal. I'm super appreciative of bringing them up.
Yeah, yeah. So moving really from that fear-based compliance to the true, empowerment, and then from bureaucracy to really service learning. To your about the buddy system. I watched Santa Monica, Malibu. They had their fires, and they had to close down school, but they had buddies. So every kindergartner had a fifth grade buddy. And I would watch
Wow.
these fifth graders come with the little ones and help them write. They had to write, I think they were doing pollinators. And so each child picked where they wanted to do a bee or a bird or whatever it might be. And the older kids were helping them read the text, take notes, and then write out their story. It was amazing to watch. And we aren't doing enough to empower the kids to help each other, right? The
Mhm.
teacher's one mere mortal, but when you can really help kids begin to help each other, that's powerful. And that's what we want. We want collaborators. We want kids that really can come together and share and help each other. And we aren't doing that enough, right? To help them build those skills of how do you collaborate? What do you do when someone doesn't agree with you or has a different opinion? And they need to practice those things, right? We need to come together and let them practice those in an environment that's a low effective filter, so that they can really start to bloom. The other thing that happens is the older kids are just beaming with pride. And I would go out and watch them at recess, and they would run up and hug their buddies.
Oh,
It
yeah.
just was a beautiful thing to watch and so simple. I always talk about high yield, low prep. Whatever we're doing, try and find those high yield things that don't require a lot of prep. And setting up buddy systems or mentor systems is a really easy way to begin to really build climate and culture in a school. And it doesn't cost anything, right? It's
No, and I think a lot of people agree with you on this. Even Cynthia said, and I know Cynthia works at the collegiate level, and at the end of the day, that this peer assisted learning and the impact that it has, it's not just cross age, it's not just cross generational, cross cultural, people from the other side of the tracks that you may live in. It's these types of experience that not only develop us as learners, but develop us as humans, right? Eventually we're going to live in communities with other people. And I think this starts, I'm wondering why fifth grade and kindergarten? Is it just so happened they were all in the same building? Is there something about that spread of age that's more effective? Do you have any idea, Danelle?
The teachers were friends.
Simple as that.
Yeah,
Okay.
they were kindergarten teachers together. One teacher moved up to fifth grade and missed the little people and said, "Gosh," and they brought in a program called PALS to kind of help them figure out how to do this effectively. And so, yeah, it was just two teachers said, "Hey, let's try this and see how it goes." And then other teachers then adopted it. They were like, "Oh my gosh, this is amazing. Little so and so is having trouble getting out of the car every morning, tears, crying." They went and got the buddy and said, "In the morning, could you come and meet at the gate?" And I happened to be there the day. We're all watching from the office, right? Seeing what's going to happen. The little guy got out of the car, no tears, waved to his dad and grabbed his buddy's hand, and the buddy walked him to class, right? And so
That's
just like
amazing.
that, right? We just have to think out of the box. Um, Thinking of data, right? So really, once they come up with their inquiry question, they come up with their success indicators, then I normally ask them, and we're really about data as a flashlight, not as a chancla, not as a hammer, right? Really looking at, and so then they decide what are we going to look at the end of the 30 days as evidence of learning to say, is this working? Is it not? And that's the other piece is rather than top down, everyone takes these same assessments every 4 weeks and looks at data, they decide what the data is going to be. Sometimes it's a writing sample, sometimes it's walking classrooms, sometimes it might be a project, it might be an outward facing community day where they share their project based learning, but letting them choose what that data is that we're going to look at in 30 days to decide whether we had impact or not, or do we have to adjust? And so often after the 30 days, they'll be like, now we have to adjust. Like we didn't take these things into consideration. So they'll keep the same inquiry question or they'll adjust it a little bit and then do it for another 30 days. Right. And that's that continuous improvement cycle rather than abandoning something. Often there's great initiative. They do it for about a week and then it's abandoned, right? Then we add a new initiative. They've come up with it, so they own it. And then they'll say, we're ready to move on, like the high school. We're ready to move on from tardies to now. We've really got a solid plan. Kids are coming to school on time. We nailed it. Now we're ready to move to the instructional model of block scheduling. And that's what they wanted to work on next. But that simple thing of letting them choose is game changing, right? To empower them to pick the problems that they see on a day to day and actually, find some solutions, come up with something. That's where everyone gets to bring their best ideas. You get tight around what the inquiry cycle is about, but you're loose around how they do it.
Mhm.
Then everyone comes together and say, how did you do it? What did you try? Did that work? Did it not? And so they'll actually share and then they'll come up with agreements. So community where it says co-create community agreements. At the end, I say to them, we're going to put on a piece of paper that we aren't going to collaborate. We aren't going to sit here and talk and not move to action. What are the things we're agreeing to do as a community? Unless everyone at the table agrees, it doesn't go on the poster.
What's an example of something that they started measuring after 30 days? They kind of looked at it and they decided, you know what? We need to measure something else. We need to
Mm.
make some change here. What's an example of that?
Um, we had a school that was working on math. They decided they wanted to do exit tickets because they realized they were kind of getting to the end of the unit and there were quite a few kids that weren't grasping the concepts. And so they decided they wanted to do exit tickets, bring them together after 30 days and see how did your kids do? How did your kids do? They ended up looking there, oh, 100% of my children were proficient. Yeah, but you asked a DOK1 question. I asked a multi-step real world problem. And so they thought, oh, maybe we should calibrate a little more on what kind of questions we're asking at the end of the day so that we can come together and really see who's getting it and who's not. And I often just have to sit and be quiet because I could have said to them, "Oh my gosh, you can't just go and, everyone make up your own question. You're not going to really be able to see who's having success, who's struggling." And so but they have to come with it on their own. They have to decide. Sometimes if they're going to go off the rail and pick something, I'll say, "Oh gosh, I've seen that tried a lot of times. Here are the things you have to be careful of. Like here are some things you're going to run into." And then they'll come back after and be like, "Oh my God, Danelle, that was a train wreck. That didn't go well at all." But we learned something. We learned something from that process. So what are we going to do to make it better next time?
I
And so
can imagine
they'll
if
come
you
up
had a
with resources.
resource guide of all the things that you could possibly measure, it would be eye-opening to people because I think they're always looking at these same statistics, and that's where at the human intelligence movement, these are things that we're realizing, right? We can have all the best frameworks, we can have all the best definitions, we can have all the best whatever. But if it's not easy to adopt, it's not easy to understand, nobody's going to feel that they belong to anything. Right. So I think that what we're realizing is whether it be guides, checklist, best practices, a list of things that can be measured that are perhaps outside the box. These are some of the most important tools. Matter of fact, I was blown away to your answer. Like, I like to consider myself a social scientist. And I'm like, well, how is it fifth grade and second grade? I'm thinking there's got to be some scientific reason, brain development. It's because the teachers were friends. Just that simple. And
Yeah.
every single time you say something like, well, a simple approach, or it's just that simple, that's where everyone needs to tune in because it's the complexities that cancel people from making change that they want to make.
Mhm.
And I think you eliminate that with your approach.
Yeah, just try it. Try it. High yield, low prep. Try something, right? And then let's see how it goes. Think about how many meetings in a school. I know we have some teachers on the call. Think of how many meetings you have in a day, but they're all very much so someone shows up with an agenda. You're supposed to sit and listen. How many meetings do you have in the school day where you feel free to ask questions and disagree?
I, I could answer for most of them. Probably never, right? In a situation like that. I know, my better half's a teacher 36 years. She's retiring this year. And I've seen her come from probably the most hands-on, experiential, project-based learning teacher to just being beat up by the system, where she feels that if she raised her hand and brings up a point, boy, she's on the chopping block then. Even though she's close to retiring, there's still that fear that exists when I know truly all she cares about is the best outcome for the students,
Mhm.
right? So it's clear to me that this isn't just something for teachers, but it's something that district leaders need to understand this approach, because if they truly understand it the way that you've helped us all today, I can't imagine why they'd object, but I'm sure that they will from time to time. You know.
Yeah, yeah, because they think they're not doing their job if they're not holding real tight. It also adjusts what they're doing. So one district I worked with in Kansas, what they realized is we're letting the teachers do these inquiry cycles. Our job is now to support whatever it is they're doing. Because at the end of the inquiry cycle, they'll say what went well, what do we need to adjust, and what support do we need. So now your role as a district leader is just to support whatever the schools are working on. What ended up surfacing is that particular district was pulling teachers out. They had to get subs for trainings. And so they were saying how awful it is to have to write a sub plan to go to a meeting about a PD. And so what ended up happening is the district office and the school board ended up with their own inquiry cycles. How are we
Wow.
going to solve this problem? It doesn't make any sense to self-inflict subs onto a system that's already stretched to the limit. How are we going to do this? And they came up with a plan to hire an outside company come in and do PE, music, and art to release the teachers where they didn't have to write sub plans.
That's amazing. You can tell a lot about a teacher by their level of stress when the sub plan comes out, right? Like they're the teachers that spend 8 hours for a sub plan for 4 hours of class, right? And then there are the teachers that I've noticed that simply don't care. Oh, somebody else will be in the room. They've got this covered. And what you're proposing here is that what you drew attention to was the district themselves, the school themselves, they thought about the problem as a whole. And they thought about how we can eliminate it across the board without nickel and diming the process. I think that's brilliant. And I think that should also go in your next book about ways that we can change education here.
Yeah. Definitely. And so then back to, neuroscience of joy. We really want teachers to be joyful. We want them to enjoy what they're doing. You think about they say teachers have burnout. I was a teacher, but when I was loving what I was doing, I was never burned out. It isn't until you're not doing enough of what you love that the burnout comes. right? Because you have to do this, you have to do that. And oh, there's no time for us to do manipulatives or hands-on activities or, go down a rabbit hole about a question a kid had, right? And so that's where they kind of lose their joy, is they are really the architects of learning, and we're taking that away by being too tight. I think one of the things caused by COVID is we seem to think we had to get tighter on follow the curriculum with fidelity, give these assessments every 4 weeks, look at the data, decide how to intervene. Instead, let's really look at how can we make instruction funner, right?
Yeah.
At the beginning, because when kids are enjoying, when teachers are enjoying, then there isn't that burnout. The burnout comes from too many initiatives, add on one more thing, not doing enough of what they love. And so really just kind of letting them have some freedom to design what it should look like. What should learning look like for their kids, and discover their why. Why did you get into education? They're leaving because they're not getting to do enough of what they love.
I know one of the districts around me just brought in this new ELA curriculum, if you will. I believe it's called Amplify, something of this nature. Very rigid, right? You have this specific hour-long lesson. You have to do everything that way that day. There's zero room for the teachers to put any kind of creativity or observational things with the students in this curriculum. And I see that those changes that happen in districts really wear down the teacher. And I think that affects their joy, as you draw
Mhm,
attention to. And
mhm.
without that joy, it's boy, we're leaving something out of the classroom that those students really need, that joyous teacher. Very good point.
Right. And what I say to districts when they say, oh, we have a new adoption, Danelle, and we want them to follow with fidelity. And I say, well, what I would like you to think about is teachers are artists. The materials are the paint and the clay,
Wow.
right?
That's
Let
powerful.
let them use that material, right? But let them decide, I'm going to do a little of this, and I found a great video and I found a good article for them to read, or whatever it might be. But really, when you get that rigid and it becomes mandates and you have to follow, what do you mean you're not? I've watched, where principals walk in, they're not using the book. That's okay. The kids are enjoying it, right? Look at the kids, not what the teacher's doing. Look at the kids. They're excited about this article they're reading. They're discussing it. They're debating. They're arguing, right? And so really look at that. But that's what I think has happened is we've gotten too tight. And so we really need to kind of let go a little bit, and let them enjoy what they're doing.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah. And so educational visionaries, one of the things that I love to support, calling them the tall poppies, those people that are out in education that are really trying something different, that really are wanting to do something different around the human work and, tech with purpose. And so looking for those tall poppies out there that really need some support, because they're often the ones that are the leaders at the school. But what we unintentionally do is give them more work to do, right? Instead of supporting them, we're asking them to, give the PD, and they often don't have the support that they need to keep flourishing. And so, really looking for those leaders, those education visionaries that are really willing to try something different.
I think you nailed it here, especially when it comes down to even things like the tech with purpose. It's all about intentionality,
Mhm.
right? If we do things with intention versus just the idea that this is the status quo, we have to do it, it changes the entire outcome for the student and more or less the communities and society as a whole. I think that's super powerful.
Yeah. And what we have to start preparing for is what I call a geographically fluid education. If work is going to be hybrid, I see this a lot in districts that I work in. Can you get me some work together for Chris? Because he's going to be gone for 2 weeks because we're going to Tahiti and we work from home. So some school boards were like, no, we're going to deny that you can't go. And they're like, we're going. Like, you can't deny us taking our child. So, and then the fires, right? And then COVID. We really have to begin to think about a education system that's a little more geographically fluid, where kids could, I imagine a world where kids could say, you know what, I'm not feeling so good today. I'm gonna do school from home, right? If you could work from home, why can't we do school from home? And imagine if kids had the power to say, I just broke up with my boyfriend. I'm not feeling like I want to go to school today. I'm a little overwhelmed. Letting them tap into their own mental health and make decisions for what's best for them. Or, you know, I'm sick, right? And then you have the work that, but that's a hard for teachers to do because it's a lot to juggle. But with the technology we currently have with AI, with Zoom, right? This wouldn't have been possible, years ago. How do we use that to make that geographically fluid education where kids are happy and they're getting to pick and choose, what does it look like for them, as well as for parents and families, you know, when sometimes families run into issues and they need, kids to be with them or they're going away somewhere. Um, how do we provide that for them so that it meets the needs of the children as well as the adults?
I've never heard of this concept, this geographic fluidity, as you mentioned. Boy, that's powerful. It makes a lot of sense. And this is definitely a skill that needs to be learned early in life because as an adult, careers are fluid that way. Meetings are fluid that way. If you're not accustomed to being able to adapt, to be resilient, have perseverance when there's challenges, boy, we're cutting them short. So I
Mhm.
think that's super powerful.
Yeah. And so just, to wrap things up, I would love to hear from you in the chat. What was your most valuable point of the things we talked about? It's feedback for me to hear, really choosing curiosity over compliance. But of all the things Chris and I talked about, what was your most valuable point? If you could drop that in the chat, that would be super helpful. And then I would love to hear from you, Chris. What was your most valuable point?
Why people are answering. I think what you did is you opened my mind to something I wasn't aware that was going on. I didn't realize there was a movement of people like you who are here looking at this fundamentally different. And it's the idea of bringing that empowerment back to the teacher. I think that is so very important. But also, I live in this world where things need to be measured always, right? You live in a kind of science world and everything. I never thought about the importance of measurement the way that you drew attention to today. The idea of these small spurts. If I were to go to my business partner and say, hey, listen, we're going to measure something in 30 days and perhaps pivot, he'd be like, oh, that's not enough data. We need 5 years of data here. But you see, it's then I ask him, well, you're the one who preaches fail fast,
Mhm.
fall forward, change things quickly. These kind of skills that we teach people in Silicon Valley for success. This is the first time I've heard someone bring it up in the environment that
Mhm.
you are today. So that's my major takeaway in this. I could tell you you're a wealth of knowledge, but I believe you do something even more important than share all this knowledge with us today. I believe that you help teachers believe that this is
Mhm.
possible, right? And you've proven it. And you can have tons of things that are true, but there's a difference between having something that's true and actually people believing it. I believe in what you're doing here today. So, and I see a lot of comments to that same, the tall poppies, Andrew Moss drew attention to. I never heard that before. Andrew, thank you so much for your contributions today. Cynthia, anyone else that have commented on here. Where do people find more information about you, Danelle, and where can they work with you?
Oh, LinkedIn. So just reach out to me on LinkedIn, or if you look at innovated.com, but reach out to me on LinkedIn and happy to help with, brainstorm, hear what your challenges are and help any way I can. Because to your point, what I want to do is I want teachers to believe that they can make change, right? That's the first step in collective efficacy is that they believe that they can create change in a system that feels overwhelming. And so once we can do that, then we just create these change makers. And then what I find is they're often the ones that decide to be principals. They decide to move up because they feel empowered. And so that's my hope.
Well, Danelle, you've been super empowering for me today. I'm going to immediately take some of the things I learned here and apply it to some of the adult teaching programs that I'm working in. And matter of fact, the first thing I'm going to do is reach out to some of the co-teachers and figure out what we can wrap. I want to ask them what they consider measurements of success. I never thought about this before. And I'm going to find my version of a fifth grade teacher to do my swap to get people involved to what Dr. Sistek drew attention to, these kind of cross-age, cross-generational things. I really appreciate all that you've had to offer today. And for those of you that attended live today, I appreciate all of your feedback and all of your comments. More power to you. I know so many people will watch this after the fact. Let me just draw attention to two upcoming events that we have. We have our Unscripted Intelligence Game Changers. For those of you that know Human Intelligence Movement, like many of you are going to be down at FETC conference at the beginning of the year. We're also doing live podcasting from down there. So please check out our series. Some truly innovative people with innovative ideas, much similar to Danelle at the level of innovation. We talk about that on this podcast series. And then we have our new member mingle coming up December November 5th. So for those of you who haven't participated in that, please do. And of course, you can find us online. You see we put tons of LinkedIn content and all this, but what I'm more interested in anything is for more of you to consider joining our Action Collective with people like Cynthia, who's on here today, who's made a huge impact in our research work. People like Danelle, trust me, I'm recruiting you. You're coming on in, Danelle. But these action committees where we're building pods, because I've seen enough frameworks. I've seen enough rubrics. Of course, we need to create. I want to see action, right? So I want to help people get their ideas into pilot and help change the world. That's what we're doing at the Human Intelligence Movement, but we wouldn't be able to do it without all of you. So again, this is Chris Foltz on behalf of the Human Intelligence Movement and our amazing guest, Danelle Almaraz, who was here today discussing some truly innovative approaches. I implore all of you to follow us and join on our next event. Thank you so much for joining us all today, and have a great rest of the week, everyone. Take care.